Ever notice how much of modern life feels like navigating a maze of closed doors? You press 1 for customer service, fill out Form 8B, check the appropriate box, and get trapped in endless loops of procedure that demand total compliance without an ounce of context, empathy, or common sense. We usually treat this as a bureaucratic flaw, but it is actually a perfectly accurate reflection of our own neurology, specifically how the left hemisphere of the human brain operates. Psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist calls the left hemisphere the emissary. Its entire biological function is to take the fluid, interconnected, living reality we experience and chop it up into explicit, manageable fragments. Once it isolates those fragments, the emissary rebuilds them into a self-contained system. It creates a map. This logic is incredibly useful for manipulating our environment, but it produces a virtual world that is completely disconnected from the actual territory it represents. When we spend all of our time staring closely at the map, we stop walking on the actual Earth. We navigate a filtered, verbalized simulation, trapping ourselves in a reality where the word is entirely mistaken for the actual thing. Now scale that up. If a single human brain can get trapped in its own map, what happens when an entire global civilization starts running exclusively on emissary logic? Historian Yuval Noah Harari points out that human cooperation relies on what he calls imagined orders. Things like borders, legal systems, and fiat currency do not physically exist in nature. They are structural fragments generated entirely by our collective imagination. This diagram outlines a healthy cognitive hierarchy. The right hemisphere, the master, provides broad contextual wisdom, while the left executes the action. But we have undergone a catastrophic inversion. The executioner has swallowed the master, trapping lived context inside rigid borders. McGilchrist's work provides anatomical evidence for this cultural shift, showing how the left hemisphere's competitive drive for power has physically marginalized the right's holistic understanding. Because of this, the unchecked emissary treats anything it cannot quantify as a threat. It takes the vibrant sources of intuitive life, the rhythms of nature, spiritual traditions, the messy reality of art, and drains them, forcing them into sterile analytical spreadsheets. We are left with a civilization-scale liability. The imagined orders that originally helped humans build societies have mutated from useful tools into intellectual dead ends, inherently isolating and alienating the individual. We can view this trap through a core philosophical binary: knowledge versus understanding. On the screen, the rigid 1 represents textbook knowledge, static, articulated data. The pulsing 0 represents understanding, or gnosis, direct experiential truth. The left hemisphere cannot process the 0. Confronted with fluid reality, it applies a mechanical filter, flattening the world's depth to deal exclusively in ones, two-dimensional paper shadows. When we apply this binary to our past, what we are taught in schools as his story reveals itself as a massive, institutional 1. It is a highly curated blueprint, an algorithm designed by those in power to maintain control. True history, however, is a 0. It is open-ended, dynamic, and constantly being reinterpreted. You cannot read it in a state-approved textbook. You can only access it by engaging with the world through your own inner gnosis. If you accept the static, institutional version of events, you surrender your autonomy. You are reduced to a non-player character, blindly executing a procedural script written by the arrogant hostility of controllers. To break out of that procedural script and discover your authentic individual purpose, your true will, you need a method. This is where eclectic spirituality becomes a practical tool. Look at the philosopher Alan Watts. He completely refused to be placed in an intellectual box. By seamlessly blending Zen, Taoism, and a highly contagious sense of humor, he actively short-circuited rigid academic dogma to experience reality directly. Watts embodied a core Gnostic principle: self-knowledge is identical to divine knowledge. Because your self is entirely unique, your path to understanding the universe cannot follow anyone else's map. True sovereignty cannot be downloaded from an institution, and it certainly cannot be copied from a guru. It requires taking back your own inner authority from the emissary's rigid systems. This conscious reclamation of authority is the foundation of the sovereign protocol. It is the daily practice of taking the left hemisphere's linear analytical outputs and intentionally subordinating them to the right hemisphere's empathetic, holistic synthesis. This protocol is essential because Harari's imagined orders are incredibly fragile. To maintain their grip, historical controllers routinely deploy a fog of forgetfulness, quietly rewriting the rules to keep the public beguiled and compliant. You are the countermeasure to that fog. The conscious individual acts as a social checksum, a non-volatile backup drive for generational memory that keeps the empirical chain of truth completely intact. By observing and documenting the true story with genuine empathy for the other, you create a roadblock. You actively prevent the system from overriding reality with its own convenient figures of falsehood. Cultivating direct knowing over blind belief strips the emissary of its power to define your world. When you hold the empirical chain of truth, you stop functioning as a line of code in the system's simulation and gain the authority to program your own reality.